Hello, everyone, and welcome to this eighth webinar out of the 9 webinars that we are having on problem solving for your final report. So it's been a long time since we last connected. I think we had some office hours in August, but the last time that we did content together was in July. So I hope that for all of you, your projects are moving forward really well. I think you're probably starting to see a little bit the light at the end of the tunnel now. So we have 3 more sessions together. Basically, today's webinar, during which we're going to talk content, so theory. The next webinar will also be theory, and then the very final one will be office hours. So as far as this webinar series is concerned, we're definitely going to start the whole process of convergence now, converging towards the end. Today's session will be is the part where we start the shift from problem solving to communication. Okay, so essentially, as you can see, Synthesize is essentially a form of problem solving. I recommend also, but also we want to start thinking about how we're going to structure our communication about what we recommend. And then the last webinar that we're going to do is going to be all about communication, how to sort of package what you want to convey in a way that makes it interesting. So first of all, easy to follow, interesting, engaging, resonating, digestible, impactful. So from, punchy, convincing, right? So just as a reminder, you'll get the slides and the recording at the end of the session. So what we're going to do today is standard agenda. I'm going to do a quick recap of what we've done before. It'll bring us to where we are today. And then before I go into phase 6, I actually want to give you a preview of phase 7, because the thing is, phase 6 is kind of launches into phase 7. It's kind of like the reason we do phase 6 is in order to be able to do phase 7, right? So I want to give you a bit of an advanced view of where we're ultimately trying to go before we actually go into the detail of phase 6. So I'm going to do that. Then we're going to go into phase 6, and then we'll talk about next steps. So let me start with the quick recap. So again, I'm going to start in the way that I've always started, which is at the end of where we want to be, right? Where we want to be when we're presenting our results to our stakeholders, or when we've presented them, is that we want them to think and feel that like we worked on the right problem, because that's helpful for them, that they understand our solution, which means we've communicated well, so today will matter for this, that they agree with it, so today will also matter for that, and that they know how to implement it. That'll be more for next time. And ideally, they even plan to implement it, but that we don't have full control over. But the first 4 we have full control over, right? So the process we've been following is this, linear, multi-stage, multi-phase problem-solving methodology. In the first 3 phases, essentially what we did was we defined the problem we want to solve as a question about what to do. So in this case, how can a help desk restore profits within 2 years? Then we did an analytical breakdown of that problem into a question tree. That was phase 2. That gives us insight into what are the drivers of the problem and gave us the avenues to explore. Then in phase 3, what we did is we prioritized and hypothesized. Prioritized basically because we don't have the luxury of exploring everything. So we really want to focus on where we think we can have the most impact, right? And hypothesizing, this was all about essentially, instead of starting each of the questions with which we're left from a blank sheet of paper, is actually coming up with educated guesses about what the answers could be or are likely to be. Not random guesses, but educated guesses, right? That have a higher chance of being true than of being false. And then the rest of the project ends up about testing these hypotheses and getting all the insights that come with the process of testing those hypotheses. Okay, so here in the case of helpdesk, we have basically 5 hypotheses here, which are basically the green bullet points that are not struck out. Okay, so these are our best educated guesses based on data that we have and prior experience and our business, acumen about what could be the avenues for helpdesk to improve profits. Okay? Now, phase 4 is about coming up with a design. So the thing is, in order to test those analyses, those hypotheses, we're going to need to do analysis. But before we launch into analysis, we need to think about what analysis do we want to do. So we need to design those analyses. And that's exactly what phase 4 is all about. And there it's again, we want to go through some kind of a intellectual analytic process to design those analyses. So first, we want to make sure that we really capture exactly the meaning of the hypothesis. So we want to elaborate, so kind of rewrite it in longer words, right? And then we want to disaggregate that hypothesis into sub-hypotheses, and maybe again, if necessary, disaggregate again, right? And so in this case, as you can see, the original hypothesis, reduce volume of dispatches, which really mean we believe that we can do that, and that doing that will help to reduce costs significantly, is broken down. We've broken it down into 3 sort of sub-hypotheses, so 3 statements that if each of them is true, then the hypothesis ends up being true. So we need to test those 3 sub-statements, A1, A2, and B1. And then, so that's the first step in the design of the analysis. The second step is to basically figure out how, based on this, so now we know what it is that we want to test. We want to go into the process of visualization in order to come up with, figure out exactly what we need to do. And so, and essentially the idea is to take that statement that we want to test and figure out, if we were to prove that, what would it look like? If we were to prove this sub-statement, this sub-hypothesis, what would it look like? And as we draw the visualization of what this thing would, what this proof would look like, we can back out the data that we need in order to test that. And that's that is the idea behind the visualization process. And finally, of course, we conduct the analyses. And what we want to make sure is that by the time we're done conducting these analyses, that we want to just make sense of the results. So first of all, do they make sense? If they don't make sense at all, maybe we made a mistake somewhere. If they do make sense, then we just need to ask ourselves, are they conclusive or not? If they're not conclusive, we might need to redo the analysis in some way. But if it is conclusive, then what does it mean for the hypothesis? Does it tend to prove the hypothesis or disprove the hypothesis? And what are the implications of that for the bigger problem that we're trying to solve? Okay, so I think discussing analysis results with our sponsor is always a very, very good thing to do, because we can sort of make sense of those analysis results kind of together with them, and it helps them to advance in the problem solving along with you. Okay, so that's a bit the recap. Now, so like I said before I go into phase 7, into phase 6, I want to give you a little bit of a preview of phase 7, just so that you understand why we're doing phase 6 in a sense. So remember, again, this is where we want to end up, right? That our stakeholders understand our solution and that they agree with it. That's really the core. So we're going to be making a presentation to make sure that they understand their solution and that they agree with it. And the question is, what are the things that make a presentation good? And ultimately, there are 3 sort of, you could say, non-negotiable, or not, no, sorry, I don't want to say non-negotiable. There are 3 items that make a distinctive impact on whether a presentation ends up being understood and agreed with, which is what we want. So the first thing is we want to make it interesting and important. Like, so ultimately emotionally engaging. It should be interesting and important. We want people to care, because if they don't care, well, they might just not listen at all. But even if they listen, they might just agree, but just be, you know, just kind of just feel not like it's not relevant for them. And so even if you convince them, they're not going to do anything about it. Right? So we want them to care. We want them to care because we want them to implement the solution, but we want them to care because we also want them to listen as we're delivering the presentation. Second thing, it needs to be really, really easy to understand, really easy to understand. And so that means we're gonna want to aim for, you know, simplicity in language, really good structure, and just really like not having unnecessary information. We want to make it really simple. And then the last bit, of course, is that it should be convincing. So it should be based on solid logic, solid data, solid analysis. Okay. So these are the three, the quintessential elements of what makes a good presentation, or a great presentation, I would even say. So now, remember, what we want to do is we want to persuade, we want to convince, right? We want to persuade our audience of whatever it is that we have to say. And so if we want them to care, to understand, and to agree, then basically a really helpful way to do that, like a way that helps us, but also helps them, is to focus on conveying one key message, like a key message, and doing it in an interesting, simple, and convincing way. But just one key message, because one key message makes it easier to understand and easier to convince. If you're trying to convince someone of 7 messages, first of all, you have 7 challenges, right? But it's also complicated. One is much easier, and your chances of success are much higher, right? We want to make sure that we tailor this key message such that it resonates with the audience. So in other words, it doesn't just speak to them in their brain, but it speaks to them here in their heart, or less colloquially, it's more to the right brain. But so in other words, it kind of, they feel that it's relevant. They recognize the significance. It touches on things that they care about, right? So we want to make it resonate. And I would argue this, that we're not ready to start building the presentation until we're 100% clear about the key message. Yeah, honestly, start building a presentation when we don't know what is the key message is just doing a lot of work that could just end up being a bit wasteful, or certainly, and producing stuff that in the end doesn't help with convincing, because we don't even know what we want to convince people of. Yeah. So this in turn has an impact on the process we want to follow. The process. So most people, the way that they build a presentation is they do it very, very bottom up. They're like, oh, what analysis did I do? What are the insights? And how, what are the insights I want to share? How do I, in which order do I want to share this? It's very much bottom up. But actually, that's really not effective, and it's not efficient. A much better way to do this is to actually do it much more top down. So the first thing is to figure out the storyline. So in other words, figure out, what do we want to say to the audience? This is something that you solve not in PowerPoint, but in Word. Okay. And this is where 70% of the value is, 70%. Once we figured this out, because we're making a presentation, we are going to have the opportunity to visualize this. And so we want to think about, how are we going to visualize what we want to say? So here we're going to design the storyboard and the slides. Okay, so this is basically about designing visuals that make whatever it is we're trying to say easier to understand and more convincing. That's 25% of the value. The last 5%, which is the least value adding, but the most time consuming, is the actual making of the slides. Okay, but that is kind of like, that's the dumb work. I don't think that we have very good AI yet to make PowerPoint presentations, but one day we will. And so we're just going to need to tell AI, this is the storyline I want you to produce. Here's some hints about how to visualize the various aspects of this storyline. Now go do. The value is not in the execution of the slides, it's in it's all the stuff that comes before. Yeah. And then, of course, beyond the document, you're going to want to prepare the oral delivery. But following this process, it feels counterintuitive. It doesn't feel productive, because we tend to feel productive when we're working on slides. But this process actually is a lot easier to follow, and it leads to much better results. So let me already kind of describe what do I mean by a storyline. A storyline is basically it's a sequence of sentences, of messages that when you put them all together, they tell a story. This is the help desk storyline. You might remember the presentation I gave you roughly. You obviously don't remember the details, but roughly the presentation I gave you back in March, I think. This is the storyline. If you read this from top to bottom, you'll see every line is an actual message. So it's something that is debatable, that might require some kind of a proof. And when you read it from the beginning all the way to the end, it actually tells a story. And that's exactly what we want, right? So each item here is it really is a crystal clear message. Now, as you can see, this storyline is kind of structured into 3 parts. And that's what we're going to want to do, because the 3-part storylines are the easiest to execute. And in fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you what I call the Toyota of storylines. It's a really, really simple storyline, or let's say structure for a storyline. And the beauty about it is kind of like, it's a little bit like what do you call these things? Like a key that opens every door. So it's the most reliable. It works in every single situation. It's not the sexiest. This is why I'm saying it's Toyota. It's not like the BMW or the Rolls-Royce of storylines, but it works in every single situation. Yeah. And basically the idea of the storyline is the following. It starts by creating a disruption that attracts people's attention, makes people care. Then it offers a solution to that disruption. And then it finishes by reaffirming and embedding the solution in the conclusion. So in more detail, you open up with an introduction that catches people's attention and describes what it is that you're here to try to solve. Basically, we've already talked about this situation, complication, question. So what you're saying is, in this presentation, I'm going to try to answer the following question. And this is why this question matters. So the goal is that everybody thinks, yeah, this question matters. I want the answer. Okay. So now we have their interest. Then what you do is you give them the answer in the form of what's called a pyramid, a Minto pyramid. This is what we're going to cover today in phase 6. So you say, here's the answer, the key message. That's the key message I was talking about earlier, right? The thing that like we need before we start building the presentation. So the question is basically what we need in order to justify the key message. Yeah. So that's the key message. And then we have these arguments that support the key message. That's the solution. And finally, we conclude by ending on a high with a call to action, and that where we reaffirm and embed the solution. So today, in today's session, we're going to deep dive into the body, this pyramid. We already covered the introduction, the situation, complication, question when we did phase 1 in problem definition, but today we'll focus on that. Now, FYI, I think that Francesca has probably, for your interim or for your midterm review, I think she's given you a template that probably looks like this on the right-hand side. And what you'll probably notice is that like the template that she's asking you to follow for your basically summary presentation, it fits pretty much perfectly this Toyota storylines. Now, I just want to say one last thing about final presentations before we get on to today's topic. Imagine that if you were about to open a restaurant and you want to launch a social media campaign to attract people. And let's say that like, you know, the amazing thing about your restaurant is not so much like, I don't know, the decor or like the overall experience, but it's about the food itself, right? So what are you going to do in your digital marketing campaign? You're going to want to talk about the food that people are going to eat. But how are you going to do it? One option is you put in your digital campaign the recipes of the dishes that you're going to show. Yeah. Okay. Or other option is you show them the dishes, pictures of the dishes that you want to serve them. Obviously, the dishes is much more attractive. And that's the point, is that the dishes are the solution. The recipes is how you solve the problem. But by the time you get to the final presentation, the audience is not really interested in how you solve the problem. What matters is um, the solution that you propose and why it's a good solution. So avoid talking about how you solve the problem, but focus more on the solution. Okay. Good. In fact, if you just think about the help desk presentation that I gave you back in March, you'll see that you'll find the storyline. So there's the intro, there's the conclusion, and in the middle was the solution. Basically, the essence of the solution was to improve the effectiveness of the call center, right, or reduce the referral rate. And then, this was basically all the reasons why and ways to do it. But it wasn't the process steps that we took to get there. Like, oh, we first defined the problem, then we built a question tree, then we prioritized. It's not about that. Okay. Academics do this, but not we, because we're business people. And our audiences are businesses. They're not other academics, and we're not writing for each other in journals. So that's the rationale. Good. So with that in mind, now we can start talking about phase 6. So phase 6, as I was saying in the beginning, is where we start the transition from problem solving to communication. Okay, so it kind of fits here, and again, where basically this is the middle of our final presentation. Like the phase 6 solves the middle of our final presentation. So let's go back to what we're trying to do. We're trying to persuade, right? And the big idea here, right? We want things to be easy to understand and convincing. So the big idea is we want to develop an answer that's easy to understand and convincing. And a great method of communication for this is what's called a pyramid, also known as a mental pyramid. And let me just show you an example of a pyramid. Suppose that the question is, should we launch product ABC? A pyramid answer might look something like this. Yes, we should, because the business plan is attractive. Okay, why? How so? Well, there's high demand for this product. The profit potential is high, and doing this can make us industry leaders. Okay, cool. Okay, I can see why, that makes it an attractive business plan. But, why do we believe all this stuff, right, about high demand for the product and so on? Well, for all these reasons. So the point is that notice how the communication goes top down, from the big idea to the detail. That is a huge instrument in making it easier to understand. We find it easier to communicate bottom up, but people find it much easier to follow top-down communication. Okay, so that's one thing. Now, and then the whole convincing bit is just about making sure that the arguments that we build are like solid arguments. Now, this way of structuring the presentation, by the way, it sounds very fancy, but actually it's exactly what our teachers taught us in school when we were much younger, right? When they taught us to write an essay, they said, hey, have an introduction, a body, and a conclusion, exactly like the Toyota storylines, right? And in the introduction, you state your thesis. That's kind of the key message. And then in the body, you have these different supporting arguments. And in the conclusion, you kind of recap, you summarize the argument. So it's exactly the same thing. If we go back to the helplet, so there's nothing new, nothing magical about this. It's really just going back to the basics. to the fundamentals of good written communication. It's just that now we're going to be applying this to PowerPoint or whatever slide-based software as opposed to Word. Yeah. Okay, so now here's another example of a good pyramid. That's the help desk one. So how can help desk restore profitability? Well, by reducing the dispatch, they can improve profits by 5 million. Okay, how so? Well, they can do this by improving the hiring and the training, and that will give 2.5 million. Implement a tiered system, that'll give 1.5 million, and restructuring incentives, that'll give another million. And the support for all of that is, here it is, okay? When we I want to make this point again, communicating top down, it might feel strange, but from the receiving end perspective, it's just so much easier to follow. When we communicate bottom up, if I were to start like this, I'm just giving you a lot of information, and you're just wondering, it's like you might understand it, but you're wondering, where the heck is this going? And then finally, at some point, I start to kind of like get close to the main point, and finally I make it to the main point. But again, nobody wants to digest information that way. Yeah, there's a very good chance that you've lost people before they've even finished digesting this. Okay, so if we look at, let's just do a little bit of terminology. If this is our pyramid, I think you'll recognize that this is the question from the SCQ. This is the key message, also known as the governing thought. That's kind of the other language. Is the official lingo in the Barbara Minto terminology. And then we have the supporting arguments. Now, the stuff at the bottom, where does it come from? Basically, they're the result and the insights from the analysis that we've done. Right? So if you just think about all the work that you've done, all the analyses, et cetera, in the end, you come up with results and insights out of this, and that is the foundation for this pyramid. Okay? So how do we build this pyramid? What's the process of building this pyramid? So it's basically two big steps that I need to articulate this. And these two steps basically come from what is it that makes these pyramids good? So remember, these good pyramids, they solve the problem, they give an answer to the problem, and in a way that is simple and convincing, right? So there's first, the solving the problem is the content bit, right? The content bit. So what we want to make sure, what we're going to need to do in step one is we're going to need to synthesize, what's called synthesize, I will show what that means, our analysis results into insights and recommendations. And we're going to want to make sure that we have good recommendations. Okay, that's step one. That's the content. Once we have the content, then we can think about how do we communicate that simply and convincingly? That's the communication aspect. And then this is where we actually build the actual pyramid. So first we need to get the content of the pyramid, and then we need to basically shape the pyramid. Okay, so let's start with step one. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a process of what's called synthesizing. In science, synthesis is very simple. Essentially, it's kind of like when you take two things or more and you combine them and you just kind of get something new. It's exactly the same thing here. So you have a couple of pieces of data or analysis results or whatever, you combine them and it gives you an insight. So you combine them and basically you kind of ask, what you do is you ask, so what? What is it? Why is that relevant? Is that good? Is that bad? How does this connect to the bigger problem? So what? And when you ask this, so what, it produces an insight. And then you ask, so what again, and it produces the next level of insight. And you keep doing this until you actually reach a point of, oh, I've got a recommendation. It will always lead to a recommendation if you do this. Let me show you like a few examples. I'll start with a super simple example. Let's say that our friend Sasha, this is what we've observed about Sasha. Three things. Sasha doesn't know where's their wallet. Sasha is behind on mortgage payments, and Sasha forgot the spouse's birthday. Oops. So what? So what? What's the insight out of this? Well, you could say, Sasha has been sloppy. Yeah, okay. Can we get an insight out of that? Yes. If this continues, Sasha could get in real trouble. Okay. Can we get the next thing? Well, Sasha should get their act together. Okay. So that's a very simple example. But basically, it goes from observation or data, etc., or analysis results all the way to recommendation. Let me show you a different example, much more business and more complex. Suppose we have this. So let's just explain what we have here. So we have a slide here that says farm mechanization lowers costs dramatically. And as you can see, we have for 4 different countries, we have the costs of farm production. So farm production costs for cocoa, for non-mechanized farms, for semi-mechanized farms, and fully mechanized farms. So based on this data, I think we can say that yes, there's definitely an impact of mechanization on the cost structure. Okay, but so what? So if you're like, let's say a company, like a company that buys cocoa in order to make chocolate bars or whatever, so you source a lot of cocoa, why might you care about this? You might care because what you might want to do is you might want to, if you want to have sustainable cocoa, or sorry, not sustainable, but like cheap cocoa, let's say, what you might want to do is you might want to focus on countries that have higher levels of mechanization. And you might prioritize partnerships with mechanized farms. It seems obvious, but that is kind of the implication of these analysis results. That is the so what. So now, as you can see, these are recommendations.
Isn't this already included in the price anyway? Because you, as a cocoa producer, as a chocolate bar producer, you just buy by the price, and if it's mechanized, it will be better. So you don't need extra prioritization, right?
Yeah,
To
but
some extent.
hold on. If you are a very big buyer of cocoa, you can't afford to simply go to the wholesalers and or the traders and simply buy from the traders. What you're going to want to do is you're going to want to secure your supply of cocoa by going straight to the farms, right? You might still need to go, you might still need to deal with the traders, because if you bypass them, you might get in trouble. But you're going to still want to basically make sure that like you are sourcing from the right farms. So you're still going to need a strategy, a geographic strategy. So you're going to be like, okay,
Okay.
let's go to countries that have high degree of mechanization, and let's try to find the traders who work with farms that are highly mechanized.
Because the price might be yearly changing, but you still know these
Yeah,
regions will be better
and also
every year.
and maybe because you don't want these traders to sell this cocoa to somebody else, and which means that you can't access it anymore, for
Mhm.
example. Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway,
Mhm.
that's kind of the business strategy bit. But from a pure problem solving communication bit, this is an example of synthesis. Yeah. Let me show you another example. If we go back to help desk, um, and I'll just kind of show you the steps. So if you remember, these are the 3 steps, first 3 phases, right? So we have the problem definition on the left. How can I help desk restore profits? We have the question tree, and then we did the prioritization and hypothesizing. Now, if I take the one hypothesis, reduce the volume of dispatches, that hypothesis, what does it basically mean? I'm going to take it all the way to phase 6. So what does it mean? It's basically saying we can reduce the volume of dispatches. And by the way, doing this will save us a lot of money, right? So if we break this down, this hypothesis into sub-hypotheses, it might be something like this. Some technicians have high dispatch rates, and these technicians can improve their performance. If both of these are true, it means that we can actually reduce the volume of dispatches. So now we do the analysis, and what do we find? We find that, yeah, actually, there's a wide distribution of dispatch rates across technicians, which means that some of them have low dispatch rates and some of them have high, which means that, yes, some have high dispatch rates. And then the other analysis results is, let's say that like, experimental trainings have reduced the dispatch rates by 10%. Okay, so now these are our analysis results. So now we say, all right, so what? What are the possible implications of these analysis results? Well, when we combine these two results, right, so that yes, there's a wide distribution. So basically, there's technicians that are very good and technicians that are not good. And then and we have evidence that some trainings can actually improve performance. When you combine it all, what it means is that training all the technicians could reduce the overall dispatch rate by some percent. Maybe it requires an extra calculation to do that. But that's kind of the insight. Okay? It's a new insight, the new level of insight. And so then we say, okay, so what? And the next step might actually turn it into a recommendation. I mean, it's almost obvious what the recommendation is out of this, that if we want to reduce dispatch costs, help desk should, among all the other things, train their technicians. That's it. When we do it in baby steps like this, actually everything seems kind of obvious. But it's, by the time you have the answer, it seems obvious. But like, when you've just done your analysis results, you don't yet have the answer, so it's less obvious. But this whole synthesis process is what will sort of transform your analysis results into recommendations, and not random recommendations, but recommendations that are backed up by analysis. Okay, so when you've done this, when you've taken all your analyses and you've sort of taken them through the so what, machine, right? The synthesis machine. So what? And you've produced a whole bunch of recommendations, insights and recommendations. These are really valuable, really valuable. It's kind of like a bag of gold full of like great insights and great recommendations. The only issue is right now, this is just great content, but it's all unstructured and untested. We don't know yet that these are the right recommendations. So first thing we want to do is we want to make sure that these are the right recommendations. We want to test our recommendations. Test not from the perspective of does the evidence support them? The evidence does. We know that. But are they the right recommendations for our business and given the problem that we're trying to work on? And are they framed in the right way? So first thing we want to do is test each individual recommendations. Just make sure that every individual thing we recommend is that good. Now, don't be overwhelmed, but there's basically nine tests to apply, but they're super simple. Number one, is it fact-based? So as long as you didn't pull this recommendation out of thin air, if it's based on analysis, it's fact-based. Is it actionable? So in other words, did you frame it in the form of an action? Then yes, then it's actionable. Is it impactful? Do you think that it makes big impact for the business? Big enough. The next 5 tests, it's smart. Smart. The last one is I call it fit our context. It's basically, is it acceptable in the existing context? So for example, you might want to make sure that like it's not illegal, that it doesn't violate a core company value, or that it doesn't run against an existing company strategy or priority strategy, or that whatever, it's not going to go make people go haywire. So it has to sort of besides being good business, it needs to sort of pass this sort of acceptability test. Okay, so you want to test every individual recommendations. The next thing is then what is the recommendations as a portfolio, as a group. Does it make sense as a group to have all these recommendations? And here, it's just only 3 things to test for. When you put them all together, all these recommendations in this portfolio, do they solve the original problem? Do they? Yeah. And then do they do it in the way that you specified in your original project definition? So does it fit the original scope? And does it help you meet the objectives and the success criteria that you defined at the beginning of the project? And finally, the last thing to test for is, are these recommendations kind of like mutually coherent and sort of synergistic with each other, as opposed to working at cross purposes? That's it. Yeah. Once you've tested that, that means that every individual recommendation is a good one. It means that you're as a family, as a group, as a portfolio, these recommendations are good, then your pot of gold is now tested, but it's still unstructured. So what we need to do is this is what takes us to step 2, where we're now going to build the pyramid itself. We have the content. We just need to build the pyramid itself. This is what's going to give us the structure that we need for the clarity and the convincing bit. So remember, the pyramid is what we aim for. What are the inputs? Our bag of gold, the original problem definition, and the audience. These are kind of like, there are inputs and boundary conditions, if you will, right? So how do you build the pyramid? It's really simple. It's through an iterative process. So again, first, step 0, we talked about, check that all your recommendations are robust. Step 1, insert the question to answer in your pyramid. Step 2, come up with a first draft of the key message and your supporting arguments. First draft. And you know what's going to happen? This first draft is not going to be good, but you're going to test it. And you want to test it with the 4 + 5 golden tips. So the 4 are the tests for key message. What makes a good key message? Number 1, it should answer the question. It's almost by definition. Yeah, it should answer the question. All right. Second, it should be punchy. The shorter, the better in general. The punchier, the better. But of course, you have a trade-off, because the shorter, the less content it has. So it's tough, it's hard, but you want it to be punchy, because you want it to land when people hear it. When it's like, you really want it to land. It should be overarching, meaning implicitly or explicitly, it covers everything that comes below. So if I just go back to help desk, for example, let me just go back to help desk. Here it says, right, reducing the dispatch rate can improve profits by 5 million. So all the stuff that is below relates to reducing the dispatch rate. Whereas if I'd said, like, if in the key message I had said only talked about, let's say, improving the hiring and training of people in the call center, then it wouldn't be covering everything that is below. Right? So that's it. You want it to be overarching. And lastly, you want it to resonate with the audience. That's not a question of content. That's a question of framing, right? And remember, why do we want it to resonate? Because we want people to care. We want them to nod when they hear it, not just because they're intellectually convinced, but they're like, yeah. This fits with my values. This fits with what I expected. This fits with kind of like my vision of things, right? So that's exactly what we want. So, whoops. So that's it, resonate with the audience. So if you have a key message that passes all these tests, it's solid. Now, the supporting arguments, there are 5 tests. 1, you want them to support the key message. Again, it's the analog of test number 1 for the key message. Then you want to make sure that it's based on either why logic and or how logic. Yeah, but there really should be a logic in there, because otherwise, if there's no logic, then it can't be convincing. Third condition, rule of 3. So that's not a hard rule, but it's a sort of something to strive for. Rule of 3, basically what it means is, ideally we have 3 supporting arguments. Why 3? Because 3 is it's a bit of a magic number. It's kind of like the ultimate balance between having enough to make it convincing, so more than 2, but not so much that it becomes overwhelming. So usually more than 4 starts to become really overwhelming. 4 is already quite a bit to digest. So rule of 3 is kind of again, so you don't want to be dogmatic about it, but this is a good thing to aspire for. Fourth thing, we want to avoid overlaps between the arguments, because if the arguments are overlapping, then basically they're both kind of the same, and it just makes things confusing, and we lose credibility, right? So we really want like clean, like here are 3 distinct reasons or 3 distinct mechanisms to achieve your objective. Yeah? And finally, it pays to order them tactically. So, sometimes BAC is just a lot more convincing or a lot more, or resonates a lot more than ABC. It's the same content, but just ordered differently, right? So there's all sorts of different orders in which you can present things, arguments, different logic, ordering logics, right? So it can be process-based. It can be following an established convention. It can be following some kind of a chronology, whatever. But be deliberate about the order in which you put them in such a way that like you think is going to resonate and make it more convincing. So you've tested that, and usually after your first draft of your pyramid, you're going to find all sorts of problems. You're going to realize, ooh, not good. So try to fix it and repeat. Fix it, test again. Fix it, test again. Fix it, test again. And it's going to feel a little bit like a whack-a-mole game, but at some point, you're going to have a solid pyramid. And that's how you build a pyramid. It really is an iterative process. And once you build that pyramid, again, why do we even want this pyramid? I just go back to what we were discussing earlier, because it's a core foundation of your storyline. That's why we want to build this pyramid. And once you're clear on the pyramid, once you're clear on the introduction, right, the SEQ and the conclusion, then you'll be in a position where you can start thinking, okay, I know exactly what I want to say. Now I'm ready to think about how do I want to show that visually, and then you're ready to start making the slides, which is kind of like the dumb work. Okay. Good. So, checklist for this phase. So how do you know you're done with this phase? All your recommendations are derived from, synthesis of your analysis, and they meet the 9+3 golden rules, meaning each individual recommendation is good, and as a portfolio, it's a good portfolio of recommendations. That's the content. Your key message meets the 4 golden tips. That's about communication. Your supporting arguments meet the 5 golden tips. That's also about communication and being convincing. And ultimately, your sponsor has validated your pyramid, right? The red flags to be aware of, you come up with like a key message, but you haven't even discussed your analysis results with your sponsor. So now you're starting to lose track with your sponsor. Your key message is too generic or just not action oriented. Or you've added recommendations that are just, you feel are right, but they're not actually based on any analysis or evidence. We really don't want to do that. So, recap from today. Ask so what about each analysis result until you extract the key insights and the recommendations related to your original problem. Test your individual recommendations with your 9 golden rules. Test your portfolio of recommendations with the 3 golden rules. And then structure your argument with a strong pyramid. So come up with a simple and powerful key message, back it up with convincing arguments. So next steps, keep working on your projects, of course, finish your analyses, maybe start building your pyramids already, even if you're not done with your analyses, but I think it's good to make this kind of an iterative process. And then our next webinar, we'll talk about or we'll finish because we started, but how to structure the final presentation. Any questions? All right, then let me not hold you up any longer than necessary. Arsene, did you have a question?
Thanks. Yeah, not really. I was trying to understand where am I, so I'm somewhere in between of some analysis, but really not thorough as you had the steps. But some analysis is on the way. So yeah, I guess I don't have any question specific to this, but I like the structure of the pyramid, and then going top down also makes sense since the storytelling. how important is the storytelling was interesting and insightful.
Great. And I would say, I don't remember like when your midterm reviews are due.
Yeah, I made a note once. I think it was November-ish.
Okay, so it's coming up soon, right? It's
Yeah,
like
very soon.
it's a really good they're a really good opportunity to start building pyramids and start building a storyline. Because the thing is, it's first of all, you'll have something to work off of for the final, rather than starting from scratch for the final. But it's also like this is kind of it's a skill, right, to build these pyramids and these storylines. So you just start using that muscle now, training that muscle now, and it'll just make it that much easier by the time it's you need to do it for the final presentation. So I think and of course Francisca will give you feedback. So it's a really good opportunity in that way.
Yeah, yeah.
Great stuff. All right, then, in that case, have a nice evening, everybody. Good luck
Yeah,
with
thanks, you too.
your projects, and see you at the next webinar next week.
Yes, see you in a week. Bye bye.
Bye bye.